storage. All right, so there we go. So yeah, so let's do a kind of maybe a wade into the pool of the design function and talk about the 3 practices underneath, and maybe in the future as appropriate we can do deeper dives into each one. So maybe I'll share this little the SAMM website. Let's see, one participant, so share screen. Let's just do that, share. So hopefully you're seeing the little web app Safari browser with design,
Yep.
with security practices. And, you know, so I'm going to just we'll just assume, I'm not sure what the level of knowledge of the framework is for the attendees today, but we'll just kind of take it from a high level and then go into it. And then from there, we can discuss further. So, so with design, as with all the functions, we have 3 practices. We have threat assessment, security requirements, and security architecture. And as we can see here, design, you know, is concerned with those practices and activities related to how your org defines goals and creates software within development projects. This includes requirements gathering, high-level architecture, specification, and detailed design. You know, a very kind of quick way of, I think, introducing it into your organization as a pattern of thinking is to say that you're focused on security by design. And this is a practice, these are the practices that will help you achieve that principle when you're building software. You know, and so I think they're almost sequential, although, you know, maybe architecture and requirements can be interchangeable. But when I work with teams who are building software, one of the kind of ideal things to go through, in my opinion, first is to do what we call a threat assessment practice. And there are 2 streams within that, I think, that are highly relevant and are foundational to get you started on focusing on the things that are valuable to what you're building versus trying to focus on security that may not be too relevant to what you're building. And again, anybody, please chime in with alternative points of view or other thoughts around this as I speak very stream of consciously through this. So as you can see, threat assessment focusing on identifying and understanding project risks based on functionality. The 2 streams that we've kind of pulled together and identified in this are application risk profile, which at a maturity level 1, as we see here, is, you know, a basic assessment of the application risk performed to understand likelihood and impact of an attack. And the second stream, B, is threat modeling, which many of you in security have probably heard that term and have maybe even take part in some threat modeling activities. Perform best effort risk-based threat modeling using brainstorming and existing diagrams with simple threat checklists. In my experience, what I like to do is try and, you know, with the application risk profile, you know, in your organization, in the company you work for, understanding how that application fits into the larger context of what the company does as a business, and understanding, you know, the risks that it's going to present to the company, whether that might be reputational risk, financial risk, other types of risks that might be an outcome of that application being implemented and deployed. And then understanding that will help drive, you know, to some degree, the amount of effort that the organization is going to be willing to expend on other security related activities, including potentially threat modeling. When I think of some of the projects I've been involved with, when you're building, you know, large scale, high revenue generating systems, maybe they involve, you know, lots of financial value, or they have very sensitive data. Perhaps you're in a HIPAA compliant organization, you're containing patient information or personal information that has to be highly protected, versus, say, comparison to building a website that's a marketing website that maybe is just gathering leads and has very little data stored in it. You're going to approach the risk of those 2 applications is going to be very different from each other, in my opinion. And that assessment that you're doing should be done so you're not going to try and make your marketing application the Fort Knox of marketing applications, because but in that reference, I mean like making it extremely secure, overly secure. Putting the ice cream cone into a bank vault, as it were, is not going to bring much value to the organization. Whereas your other application, where it's a revenue generating application, perhaps like an e-commerce platform, the risk of that having a security incident or being compromised or breached is going to have a much bigger impact on the business than something happening to your marketing application. So that's how I think of the application risk profile. And in some organizations, this kind of risk assessment may not even be done because security is brand new. So starting with that approach and this particular activity, you're going to have a good understanding of how much effort you should expend from a security perspective.
May I already start asking questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what I get what the practice is about in theory. In practice, what would be the correct strategy for a application, in this case a product, that is it is being used in different industries, and each industry has their own risk profile. So if you follow the easy way out for an application, like, hey, let's design it for the most secure, or the implementation that has the most stringent requirements, you end up with almost total security, the very, very, very compliant approach that you spoke about. However, for the most part of the other industries, it wouldn't be as valuable. Are there any ways, patterns, or standards that would allow you to define the risk profile more granular, or based on circumstances?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are. So one of the best known examples of application risk profiles, and although that is the industry accepted term, it's really a bit of a misnomer. What you're trying to talk about here is the system impact assessment. So there's actually a NIST 800 document that directs federal agencies in how they're supposed to go about assessing this. And there are a lot of application risk profile questionnaires available. But the real idea in this practice is that you work from what's important to the organization. So you understand senior leadership's risk appetite, the things that keep them up at night and that they're most worried about ensuring they protect against. And then you craft that questionnaire in order to get your team the information you need to know about how the applications in the portfolio stack up against those concerns. And the thing you're coming out with is an impact. So in the NIST framework, you're assessing systems as either low, moderate, or high impact systems. And then that drives the required security baseline in 853. So you're trying to emulate that process to the level of formality that your organization needs. So that's why everything about SAMM is meant to be tailorable to what you're concerned about, how formal your organization needs to be, and the things that are most concerning to you.
Yeah, and I would say, just to piggyback a little bit on what John said, there's in the earlier functions in governance, for example, we have the policy and compliance practice. And in the policy and compliance practice, as you go through that, the details of that practice, one of the things you're going to know are what are the drivers that are related to your business in terms of, regulatory controls that you might need to be compliant with that could impact, the degree that application's maybe going to have, the risk impact that's going to have to your organization. So those are going to be drivers, I think, into your threat assessment and into the application risk profile as well, at a high level. So we're not going to necessarily expect to have to think about, maybe not too much. You could certainly have a checklist to say, is it relevant to consider HIPAA controls and things like that when it comes to this application's risk profile to this organization, and it could be quickly removed from that consideration and focus on the areas where it may have some kind of, and focus on those areas that will have an impact. I will just open it up to go through this, and we can show some of the quality criteria. If you're, I'm going to make this a little larger. In maturity level 1 are shown here. An agreed upon risk classification exists. The team understands the risk classification covers critical aspects of the business the organization is facing, and the organization has an inventory of application and scope. I've been in some orgs where there's so many things going on that the inventory itself is actually a real challenge. So do we have a list of all the applications that are actually running in this organization, and then starting from there as a foundation, which is certainly part of the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework, know what you have, and then you can then focus on what the possible risk to those things may be. If you don't know that you have it and someone's standing up systems that you have no visibility to in it, you can imagine that your risk is increasing immensely, because you're increasing the attack vectors that are possible, the exposure that you're presenting to the company and to the world to be attacked. So inventory being first at a maturity level 1. Internally, maybe using this agreed upon risk classification, and it's understood by all the teams that are involved that are building it. And then, it's covering the most critical aspects of your business risk. Generally, I think those are going to be financial, but also, reputational. And I don't know what some other examples someone may toss out about risks that are beside those two I keep referring to, but
regulatory.
Yeah. Maturity level 2, this is not just you now have this inventory and you have some kind of general organizational risk, but now all of the applications within your organization are aligned with that risk standard that's been developed, and everybody kind of understands it, and that understanding is what drives the inputs to security requirements and security architecture as you're building things out. So we also have here, you validate the quality of the risk profile manually or automatically. And the application risk profiles are stored in a central inventory. So in some orgs, and the more mature ones are going to have some kind of risk management function that's actually going to do a lot of this for you. That may be the case, and in other places there may not be that type of maturity and or function within the organization that's responsible for doing it. So I think the prescriptive information that we have here for this activity will allow you, if you're kickstarting this in your organization, to come up with some ways of doing it. I don't think on this particular page we have any links to anything specific, but as John mentioned, some of the NIST 800 documents, those are probably some things that could be leveraged. Not to put anyone on the spot, but if there are other kind of tools that people know of that might help somebody do that, that might be worth mentioning them. Yeah.
Hey, John, I've got a question. If you scroll down, please.
Yeah.
So the validation of the application risk profile, how can this be done automatically?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, honestly, how you might do that from a quality perspective. Certainly quantifying, you can look at the amount of investment that to secure a particular application and reduce the risk is going to cost versus say, maybe something like revenue at risk. I don't know, John, do you have a a thought about quality versus quantity, quantifying that?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a fun criterion, but what it's really saying is that you're not, say, sending a questionnaire out to your system owners, they're filling it out, and you're just accepting what they present on face value without ever doing anything to check their work. In particular, I was working at a federal agency once where the person responsible for submitting the risk profile intentionally downplayed the risk because they wanted to avoid certain security controls, which actually led to a couple of contract staff being fired. But so it was this matter that we had to go back, and when we looked at the submitted risk profile questionnaire and compared that to what was actually in the code base and the demonstrated functionality in the system, then the CISO got involved and the contracting officer got involved, and it got very messy because we did this validation of the risk profile. So that's really what this is talking about, is whatever process you're using to get the profile inputs, you're checking to make sure that the inputs are in fact valid. So completeness of the submission, fact checking against existing metrics and KPIs is useful. In fact, you can take the approach of a lot of taxing authorities and start pre-filling information in the questionnaire because we already know the answer. So those are some aspects that come into this, air quotes, automatic validation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had this recently come up in my organization where we had a penetration test done for an application. The risk was identified as being pretty high, and to John's point, you're going to not just trust, but you're going to trust and verify. So we're in the process of reviewing their claim that the findings have been addressed, they've been mitigated or remediated. So now we're going through and having that testing redone. It is manually in this case for a pen test, but so now we can update and confirm that risk profile is accurately reflecting the current state of the system. So maturity level 3, this one is timely update of the application classification in case of changes. So and the question here is, do you regularly review and update the risk profiles for your applications? And that means that your organizational risk standard considers historic feedback to improve that method, and significant changes in the application or business context trigger a review of the relevant risk profiles. This is one of those things where when you go from maturity level 2 to maturity level 3, it's that reflecting back on what you've been doing in maturity level 2, but doing it on some regular cadence. I think that's kind of the pattern with all of our maturity levels, is that, looking back annually to review those activities and practices that you're doing within a particular maturity level. Here, it's saying you have a periodic review at an enterprise-wide level. As your enterprise matures and software assurance, stimulate teams to continuously question which changes and conditions might impact the risk profile. For instance, internal app might become exposed to the internet by a business decision. And that would trigger the teams to rerun the risk evaluation, update the application risk profile accordingly. A common one that I feel like I'm encountering more frequently is actually the challenge of technical debt and the increased kind of risk that having old systems that can't be updated for various reasons, whether business or technical, that risk profile is actually increased from when it was initially released in the organization. And so having that kind of recurring review of that system at some cadence, ideally annually or whatever is appropriate for your organization, is definitely an important thing to do. So thoughts, comments on application risk profile? Okay.
Yeah, just one general note, and this is what you were alluding to here, John, is a lot of these practices are connected. And at level 3 of the practices is where the organization has matured to the point that they've got feedback paths among the practices. So as John was saying, if your policy drivers change, say a new regulation is enacted, or you know there's an impending change to a controlling regulation, then that's going to drive a change in the risk profile questionnaire, which is going to drive reassessment of risk profiles. If you have a change in board direction, so now their risk appetite has changed, then that's going to flow through the other practices. And so these level 3 feedback and review mechanisms are really where you've got those connections working smoothly.
Yeah, well played. So speaking of chaining, we also here have threat modeling, which I find kind of fun to some degree. Fun being a relative term, but it's very informative when you're doing your threat assessment and coming up with a security plan for a given system. You know, I think it's foundational so that you're focusing on the most value add efforts when it comes to security investment. So the benefit here is identification of architectural design flaws in your applications. Just to kind of extend it a little bit, it's identifying those design flaws in your applications before they're in a production environment is the real value of doing threat modeling if you can do it early. And just as a definition, threat modeling is a structured activity for identifying, evaluating, and managing system threats, architectural design flaws, and recommended security mitigations. It is typically done as part of the design phase or as part of the security assessment. You know, it does get performed outside of or against systems that are already in production if you haven't had a chance to do it before then. But, you know, you definitely, I think, will get value either way. The cost of remediating or mitigating things once they're in production is certainly more costly than if you can take care of them while they're still in the design phase. So in this particular case, at maturity level 1, you perform threat modeling ad hoc for high-risk applications and use simple threat checklists such as STRIDE. Some guidance here on avoiding lengthy workshops and overly detailed lists of low relevant threats. One thing that is helpful is to understand who the threat actors are that might be interested in your organization and the system that you're building to help understand, you know, again, that level of effort that you're going to need to invest in security to make it secure enough to protect against those threat actors and the threats that are identified. In this case, your most important tool to start threat modeling is a whiteboard, smartboard, or a piece of paper. Aim for security awareness, a simple process and actionable outcomes that you agree upon with your team. I like the whiteboard approach. There's, you know, depending on, again, the maturity of the team and the organization, getting them to all pull together some type of diagram in advance and come to a meeting with that diagram and being prepared to discuss it in immense detail. It may not be so easy to do, whereas having the opportunity to have an interactive dialogue with the people who are building it, as well as kids yelling in the background here, sorry. You know, it allows you to have, I think, a more productive process. So the quality criteria in this case is you perform threat modeling for high risk applications. You use simple threat checklists such as STRIDE, and you persist the outcome of the threat model for later use. Maybe you have some kind of wiki or document repository, or perhaps you're putting it into, say, a GitHub type repository where it can be stored with a particular project. I kind of like that approach because it becomes visible to the development teams and it's more front of mind. But thoughts, comments on maturity level 1 threat modeling?
Not really about what you just explained, but since you mentioned storing it, I recently came across the OWASP, I think it's an incubator project, the threat model Dragon, and I was wondering if anyone has any experience with that one. or any other threat modeling tools that help you structure and digitize your threat models, because organizing them is where I see
Yes.
a big challenge.
Yes, we are currently using Threat Dragon where I'm working in my day job. And the tool is, so when I do a threat modeling class, we end up spending the last half hour or so talking about the different tools. As a tool, Threat Dragon is very useful. It's a solid diagramming tool. I've never had it crash. The file format is very easy to work with because it just saves and reads JSON. There is a server version you can set up, but when you do that, your storage options are limited to public GitHub repos, which is a bit limiting for a tool where you're discussing sensitive things. So we don't use the server version. We just have it on analyst desktops. And then we're basically just using the project repos and storing the threat models with other documentation. Once you get it into whatever your repository is, then you've got, because it is JSON, you have the automatic diffing in your, say if you're using a Git repo, as people are trying to push changes, you'll get conflicts and be able to resolve those. So it helps there too. Some of the other tools, especially a couple of the commercial tools, have got some really interesting and potentially useful automated ingestion. So I believe it was Threat Modeler was the first one to announce that they could take a CloudFormation stack and draw your diagram from it. By this point, I believe a bunch of the other tools are also doing that, at least for some of the CSP automation stacks.
Yeah, and that's a bit of, we've been very interested in that automation process around threat modeling, particularly when you're using CloudFormation or Terraform to create your workloads in a cloud environment to be able to generate that threat model diagram in advance.
Right.
And especially before you actually deploy that template into that environment, so that you're not actually doing threat modeling after the fact. So those tools are really promising, but I haven't used them actually yet in a real environment. We've been looking at Threat Modeler in particular. Another tool that's probably very similar to Threat Dragon is, and is also free, is Microsoft's threat model tool. And it's a freely available one. I think at least the last time I looked, it only runs on Windows. So if you're not running a Windows system, you may have to, you may
Install
not
a VM.
Yeah. Install something else.
Yeah, I run it in a Windows 10 VM on my MacBook, but I guess just talking about those two free tools. With Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool, it comes with an extensive threat library and a pretty good catalog of template elements that are Microsoft stack specific. Threat Dragon does not have that. So that's probably the big distinction between the two tools in getting started with them, is that Threat Modeler, or the threat modeling tool, has that existing template for Azure components and so on. Possible drawback is when teams are new to threat modeling and they add an element to the diagram in TMT, and suddenly they're faced with a list of 200 candidate threats that they have to cull through, they can get overwhelmed. With Threat Dragon or a whiteboard approach, they're starting from scratch and using something like Stride or Linden, you can tease out of them the thinking about threats. So obviously my preferred approach is to use Threat Dragon and not be faced with that wall of threats that I see in the TMT.
I've been in this exact situation that you described, so that's also why I'm asking for feedback. But really valuable info, thanks.
One of the things that's interesting in this day and age, I think, that those tools don't address so much, that other tools, I've used like a tool called like Miro and other tools where you can do collaborative whiteboarding Obviously, like right now where we're doing a virtual session, you might have teams that are virtual. So, having a virtual whiteboard is a great way of doing that. And then having, the only kind of challenge I think with that approach is having an artifact that you may need to store somewhere. So you may need to export it out, but at least in terms of in today's world where there's a lot more remote working together, tools like that, are probably going to be as useful to you as threat modeling from Microsoft or Threat Dragon. Maybe it's somebody else's task to take that diagram and put it into those tools later on, but having that collaborative type of tool as well, I think is pretty handy. So I would say don't limit yourself to just having only those tools as an option, but use those virtual whiteboards too. And level one in the SAMM framework is basically saying, whiteboard is good enough. It's good enough to start with. It stimulates a conversation. You can like use Stride as an example to tease out those threats. I think an important part of this level one outside of the tooling is just make sure you have the right people involved.
Yeah.
If you just have your developers sitting there, they're always building the most perfect thing from the start. So they're never going to have any problems. You're never going to identify any threats, right? Because it's all good. But if you have somebody from customer support, from the QA team, from the customer perspective, just kind of a different point of view. And then during that conversation, you're going to have better outcomes in terms of identifying threats. That'll be, if you're using Adam Shostak's, model, like what are we building? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? Having more people involved in that discussion early on is going to give you some really great feedback into the threats that are in your design. So
one of the things I wanted to come back on with since you mentioned Miro, I also do believe that a whiteboard, like a very unconstrained environments, is a very good way to do threat modeling. However, where I would see the value of tools is that it imposes a way of diagramming on people that are new to the practice. And this is a situation that I'm in. So at least in that way, you ensure that everybody's constructing a diagram in the same manner, with the same blocks and the same kind of descriptions.
Yeah, one of the benefits I think of Miro in particular that I know of is that it has pre-canned threat modeling shapes that you can utilize in it, so that you can say when you go to start it has a template. You can say you're going to do a threat model. And
are you serious? Because that's news, and that will be a really good news.
Yeah,
I'm looking into that. Okay.
Yeah, take a look. But the last time I went to a session a couple months ago, we were using that tool and it had that capability. So if I'm wrong, I will post an answer on Slack that I'm wrong and let you know the correct answer. But I'm 99% sure it was Miro, and it did have that capability. So
okay, awesome. Thanks.
yeah.
And as something of a hybrid approach, very often I will do the first session. I just reserve the meeting room that has the biggest whiteboard we've got, and we start with that. Then someone on my team will translate the whiteboard into a Threat Dragon diagram. And then for subsequent sessions, we'll be working on updating the diagram. I guess I should also point out that we're going with the threat model every story approach, like Izar proposes.
I had a question, John, on the level of detail that you go in on the threat model. So I always struggle, like I've seen people kind of deconstruct the system to like the service level or the component level. And some people kind of end in the same fashion, have components as you would in a logical diagram, for example. How do you kind of know when to stop?
I personally advocate the stopping rule that Adam advocated. So I think it's in chapter 2 of his book where he talks about it. It's what you do is you get the diagram drawn, and there's already been a decision about what system user stories or use cases you're concerned about. And then you ask the team to point to elements in the diagram while walking through the steps in the story. And if at any point they say, oh, that's not on the diagram, add it to the diagram. Or if they point to an element and they go, oh yeah, this isn't detailed enough. Okay, explode it. And it's the whole point that it's detailed enough when it's showing you everything you need to mention as you're working through the story. Now, that's a that's kind of a fuzzy definition of done, but it does seem to work.
Yeah, and I think to just piggyback on that, I think you'll be able to quickly define and can characterize as to what's in scope and what's not. If you have kind of a high enough view, it gives you the context of what you're building, context view, and then you can dive into any of those components, or if you're building a specific feature in something that's already existent, you can focus just on that component. And then if, as part of the person running the session or whatever your role might be, you can quickly ask the question, is that in scope, to kind of keep it contained to that area, because you can go down that rabbit hole and start to threat model, well beyond the scope of whatever you're building. I do like the threat model every user story, because then your user stories are hopefully specific enough. They're smart, as it were, and they have defined acceptance criteria, as well as there's a definition of done. So if you're just layering a level of threat modeling on top of that story, your scope's going to be kind of limited to that particular story or feature that you're building, that you've defined, without going too far outside of that. Hopefully somebody's there in the room who can say, hey, we've gone far enough. This is good enough. Let's start with what we have. And again, the level one is not looking to get, you're not necessarily, the goal is not to potentially enumerate every possible threat that's possible against the system, because that list is can become so massive, it's going to, you're not going to be able to do much about a lot of those threats anyway. They're not going to be worth the effort in many cases. So curtail the scope, that's what I would recommend. Constrain it specific. So in this particular case, and there is the question that we ask is, do you use a standard methodology aligned on your application risk levels? This is linking back to the last stream in this practice, and you train your architects, security champions, and other stakeholders how to do practical threat modeling. Your threat modeling methodology includes at least diagramming, threat identification, design flaw mitigations, and how to validate your threat model artifacts. Changes in the app or business context trigger a review, just like John was recommending with the application risk profile. That same type of change in the app or business context should also trigger this new review of the threat models. And you capture the threat modeling artifacts with tools that are used by your application teams. I love the idea of having the JSON, a repository with the JSON artifact that anybody can load into the local version of the tool, whether that's Threat Modeler, Threat Dragon, or Threat Modeling from Microsoft, and load it and then make updates to it and recommit it to your repository. So it's an organic document that grows over time. I think that's a really valuable aspect of it. Just jump into, we just have a few minutes left. It's such a, you can go through time so fast here, right? So maturity level 3, assurance of continuous improvement of threat modeling activities. Threat modeling is integrated into your SDLC and has become part of the developer security culture. Reusable risk patterns comprised of related threat libraries, design flaws, and security mitigations are created and improved based on the org threat models. So there's a great benefit. I'm just gonna harp on put it in a repo where everybody can see it and access it, because oftentimes we always think we're building a unicorn, but it's probably nearly identical to something somebody else has built in the org using similar patterns, similar technologies. So that threat model can become something that somebody else can leverage and build upon for their particular application in your organization. as well as, I think, as John said, Threat Dragon has repos available of diagrams that you can pull in and start with those. So you don't have to necessarily do them from scratch. You optimize your threat modeling methodology, capture lessons learned. So that's part of the show stack model of did we do well when we did it? Did it go well? You capture lessons learned from it and use those to improve your methodology. You review the threat categories relevant to your org and update your methodology appropriately. Okay, we're going to shift to human medicine. So now we've got to change things quite a bit as a result in our threat models. From time to time, you evaluate the quality of your threat models independently. That'd be an interesting one. Maybe you could hire John DeLeo here or Adam Shostak to review it. I don't know if there's organizations that actually will do that for you, but I would imagine there are. So you automate parts of your threat modeling process with threat modeling tools. You integrate your threat modeling tools with other security tools, such as security verification tools and risk tracking tools. You consider threat modeling as code. There we go. Practices to integrate threat modeling artifacts with app code. So do you regularly review and update the threat modeling methodology for your applications? Consider historical feedback for improvement. You regularly review. There's an annual cadence to it to verify no new threats are relevant. And you automate parts of your threat modeling process with threat modeling tools. Questions, comments, threat assessment and threat modeling in particular? I think we might only get through one practice today. I see another person's joined, Chris. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, sorry I was late, but it was interesting to hear the last bit of it. I'm interested in the threat modeling and learning how to do it and all the tools available. So it's great to hear practical, real world implementations.
Yeah, I guess with the last few minutes remaining, I'll just share, some what I think are maybe some resources for those of you who are looking for those. Obviously, as John mentioned, there's OWASP Threat Dragon. OWASP, cheat sheet series has a whole cheat sheet on threat modeling. So that would be worth checking out. It's a good, reference for yourself as you're learning, or for teams who are new to it, you want to give them something to quickly understand it. We talked earlier about automated threat modeling using Threat Modeler, which can generate, I'm not sure they call it something else. I think they call it process models in their language in the Threat Modeler world, where they're automating it from your cloud workload or CloudFormation templates or Terraform, and threat modeling from Microsoft, and of course Adam Shostak's book threat modeling, which is great. I think that's probably considered one of the sources. There's also the threat library or methodologies like Stride, Pasta. I think MITRE's kill chain is kind of considered one of those. Maybe somebody agrees or disagrees, but I think that's a good reference for looking at types of threats to a system, and at least looking at your system through the lens of those. If you don't have deep subject matter experience in your group who's doing it, you can leverage those tools to kind of guide you and help identify them. So any other resources others can think of or would like to share?
One that's worth mentioning, and giving props to the team, the company where Seba is a principal, and I believe Stephen Werrick's works, Torian, they put together a really good threat modeling playbook, and they've made it available. So you should be able to do a Google search for it. I don't know the direct link.
Yeah, we can bring up Torian. Let's see, I definitely have seen that. That's a great call out, John. Thanks for mentioning that. Be in my history here. Here it is. I see it. Oh, that's my email. Never mind. I must have received a copy by mail, so you can request it from them on their website, and gives you some great guidance on, hitting the ground running. There's that cookie prompt. Love it. Yeah, so Torian, and of course, Torian does training as well. They can guide you on your journey using it. So you can fill out this form here, space this in the chat. And John triggered a thought in my mind that then left. So he'll come back to me in a moment. There's a link in chat.
Well, the one I was thinking about was the global AppSec training. So thinking here, well, actually, at this point, we don't know what training is going to be accepted for the October virtual conference, but I've submitted my threat modeling class. I'm pretty sure that someone from the team submitted to do the SAMM overview class. So you should keep an eye out for those.
Mhm.
They are relatively inexpensive. I guess between 1/2 and 2/3 of the usual day rate for training. And they're really valuable. They're taught by project leaders. So watch that on the OWASP website.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a virtual training in November for those as well. So yeah, definitely check out if you're not on the OWASP Slack channel, there's an owasp.slack.com. You can join, and there's a SAM project as well as the general OWASP community for all those training opportunities. So, and there's usually some degree of threat modeling. There's actually a great threat modeling channel on there, full of great stuff with great subject matter experts, and thanks, Pat, who can give you some, who are always giving great guidance on threat modeling. So definitely worth joining just for that alone. Just trying to think of any other resources that might be available, but we can add them later on onto the SAM Slack channel. And again, check out threat modeling channel on OWASP.
Oh yeah, I guess there are a few other things. So I mentioned Izar's threat model every story approach. He's given that talk at AppSec Cali and a couple of other conferences, so you can find recordings of it. Irene Michelin's incremental threat modeling talk from AppSec EU a couple of years ago is a really good one. So, basically the stuff that's been recorded at previous global AppSec conferences, there are some really good resources there as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we're actually over time. Does anybody have any other questions for the SAM project team who are present?
Yeah, I had a question. I just recently went through SAM for the first time, and I felt as if some of the questions, like it would be of use to have a not applicable answer. But yeah, and I mentioned it in the Slack channel, but I don't think a lot of people agreed with that. They're just some questions that were just not applicable in my scenario and would have been helpful for me to mark it as not applicable, and the scoring to have kind of factored that in. Just wanted to kind of hear what your thoughts were around that.
Yeah, I think so if I'm going to do this from memory because it's the last time I recall when if you're using the Excel toolkit and you're picking an answer from there, if you pick an answer, you can't then go and reset it to be blank. And so it's going to impact your scoring. But if you don't pick one of those answers, it's not factored into the score. Does that make sense?
Right, okay.
No, I think it still is because it gets counted as a 0.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah, a blank cell translates to a 0 in the mapping.
Yeah, so it might be worth, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this isn't really, it's not really an argument, but I would argue that none of the practices are ever not applicable to what you're doing. But what you may really be saying is making that better isn't under our control. Maybe, a common one is training. So if If you're reliant on a central training management group to decide what training gets offered when, there's nothing you can do to improve how the organization is doing at training, at least not directly. So the attitude I take about it is go ahead and give a response that reflects how the broader organization is doing, and acknowledge the fact that that is going to impact the baseline score for your applications. But remember, the goal here is not to get the best score possible, it's to get the best insight possible. So in that, using the training example, if you get there and you say, yeah, our organization is absolute crap at training, we're just not doing it, so you scored a 0, then as you're doing your road mapping and trying to decide how you want to improve, then one of the activities you might decide to do is lobby for better training. So even at that, yes, it drove your score down, but the numeric score doesn't matter. What matters is what you've learned from doing the assessment, and then using relative improvements in the score to prioritize the things you want to work on first.
Gotcha. The particular
sermon over.
the particular question that I was thinking about that was certainly not relevant in my assessment was one around third parties, and whether those third parties have a development process that aligns with yours, or and that really was not applicable at all.
Oh, then in that case, the way that I take that is you're saying, okay, well, do we have a great practice in place for all of our external parties, all 0 of them? Well, yes, we do. But one of the things, the hazard in doing that is if somebody then turns around and says, oh, we're going to hire a subcontractor,
Yeah,
the answer changes.
I was also going to mention that it artificially inflates your score a bit. So in that regard, I do see the merit of a not applicable or not counted.
That is true.
Thing. But then maybe not.
Yeah, another way of looking at it is, no, we don't have a process for that. If the need ever arises, we'll have to create one. That is a gap.
Yeah, or you just answer with the equivalent of I think it's a scoring of 2. I don't know what the exact answer is, but like the median, so it doesn't artificially inflate or deflate your scoring, and you mark it with a big red flag if it ever is needed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found the actual criterion for that to be a little problematic. But happy to chat about that some other time.
Oh, and I don't know, a lot of the things that came up in some of these are sort of like the warning labels that you see on consumer devices. The criterion is there because someone on the team was burned badly when that criterion wasn't met.
Yeah. Well, if you have ideas for it, you can definitely submit them into the Slack channel. You can also submit ideas as issues in the GitHub repository for the OWASP SAMM project. So we always welcome that feedback into the team. So keep the questions coming and keep the ideas coming, because we can always add them to future versions and updates to it where appropriate. We did have a question in chat from Richard, and he's asking, he's looking for a consultancy that can assist with doing an OWASP SAMM maturity assessment and help build a maturity roadmap. I don't know of any companies. I
can help there.
Okay.
There's a list pinned in a Slack channel from Brian Glass, I think.
Yeah.
Who pinned it in January of 2020 with a list of companies that have it on their website, or at least mention that they do SAMM assessments. And like a week ago, I updated the list and sent it for review to Brian and to Seba. If you want, I can read the list for you.
Or you can drop it into
Or
chat.
post.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I'm waiting for review of Brian and or Seba, and then it will automatically appear in the Slack channel sooner or later. So I'll ping him.
Yeah, so I'm, Richard, if you can join the OWASP Slack channel, then there's a Project SAM channel, and as Maxim mentioned, it's a pinned conversation in there with that list of assessors from Brian Glass. So you can definitely take a look there. Let me just see real fast. Oh wait. OWASP, it's owaspslack.com. And I'm going to paste that in our chat here. And then the other question Richard asked was, what time do these sessions start? Well, if I'm on time, like I should have been today, it would start at 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time. So I'm not sure where you're at exactly, but 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time on the second Wednesday of every month.
And Richard, if you're joining the Slack channel, it's mostly announced again the day of the meeting.
Yeah, so, yeah, definitely. I think Slack is probably the best place to go.
Yeah.
Besides the mailing list.
Yeah. There's a little Heroku app. So if you search for join OWASP Slack in Google, the thing you'll see is it's like owasp.herokuapp.com. If you go there, enter your email address, that auto generates a Slack invite.
Ah, there you go. Thanks for that tip, John. I just put it in the chat. So hopefully that's going to help you, Richard, to get in there. Yeah. Thanks for asking the question. So we're actually, we limited, we schedule for an hour. We always wind up going over. It's always such a fun topic. Anything else from anyone want to share? John Kennedy, did you want to share anything?
No, we're running over, but I did look at Miro, and Miro has something called the Miroverse, which is like a community section, and that might be somewhere that you can get a more specialist chart, because I had a look through my version of Miro and I didn't see anything specific around threat modeling.
Okay.
There's some risk assessment stuff, but the Miroverse, so /Miroverse, it's a community.
In the threat modeling world, yeah, they call it a data flow diagram. Generally, I don't know if you look and see if there's a data flow diagram template that's generally used for the threat modeling process. I stand corrected then if it's not there, and I'll find the right place to put it into Slack. No?
Not specifically data flow.
Huh.
But I'll drop in this because it's actually quite an interesting page anyway, but you might find something in there that is of interest. There you go.
All right. Thanks for sharing. Well,
yeah, there's definitely one mentioned in the templates directory. Sorry, I'm obviously on the bus on my phone, so I just did a quick Google search for Miro DFD, and it shows up in the template list.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for proving that I'm not crazy. It's in there somewhere.
Okay, yeah, there's something called a data flow diagram maker template.
Okay. Interesting wording, huh?
I'll drop that in.
And Richard and others, yeah, there's also a mailing list that you can join. So feel free to join that too, just to get those, yeah, if your preference is to get updates through email versus Slack. So, all right. Well, is there anything else anyone wants to share about OWASP SAMM? Going once, going twice. All right. Well,
you did a great job, John.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
I really enjoyed the meeting. It was really, really, really helpful for me.
Great. We'll mention that we recorded this, and I'll drop a link as soon as I can figure out how to get it and share it into Slack. for others who want to reference it later and who might have missed it and they want to know how to get it. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone. And nice to see you, John and John again, as well as the rest of you.
All right. Take care, John. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a great day. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.